Okay, so let's talk the FCC. The FCC stands for the Federal Communications Commission. It is the regulatory agency in the United States that oversees and regulates what's going on with terrestrial, broadcast, radio, and television, amongst other things. The FCC was created historically. It came about as a method of sort of protecting radio stations. So imagine that radio is a new invention, and all of a sudden radio stations start popping up, and people have access to radios and can access this content. Before there was any sort of regulation over radio, it was just sort of a free-for-all. So the FCC was needed in order to make sure that different radio stations had licenses that gave them particular access to certain frequencies. That way there was no radio stations that were overlapping different content on the same frequencies. So the Federal Communications Commission is the FCC. In the United States, they're the regulatory agency that governs what happens on radio and television, amongst other things. So interstate and international communications by radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable, all 50 states, District of Columbia, and U.S. territories. What this also means is that the jurisdiction is over technology that uses radio waves. So it's not just radio and television. It's also all sorts of other things that are manufactured that need to be cleared by the FCC. For example, a cell phone or a microwave or a remote-controlled car. All those things have to be passed through the FCC so that when you turn on your remote-controlled car, you don't open your neighbor's garage door, those types of things. So the FCC regulates the technology that is used, right? But it also regulates content. So we'll talk about those in sort of different ways. Okay, so here's some necessities that the FCC requires of radio stations. Now, specifically talking about radio. All radio stations have to have a public file. This is a collection of documents maintained at the station's main studio and is accessible to the general public during business hours. This is crucial. The public file is available so that any member of the public can come in during business hours and say, I need access to this particular thing, right? And that's going to be anything from a program list. So the types of programming content that is on your radio station and how it contributes to the community, that has to be accessible. The music that was played, right? The people that were in charge, what's called a chief operator, the people that were in charge of the radio station for certain hours. So a DJ who assumes control of the radio station. All that information day by day needs to be stored in a public file for up to 2 years. That needs to be accessible. And in recent years, the public file, in addition to being available in the main studio, has also been made available online through either a station website, but also through the government FCC website as well. Another important aspect of the public file is what's called a political file. So a subsection of this public file that says that, let's say that the circumstances that there's an election for public office coming up soon. The morning show person sends out an invitation to the candidates, and only the Republican candidate accepts and comes into the show to speak about their policies and all those kinds of things. Well, the radio station needs to be able to prove that an invitation was given out to all parties, and whether or not they accept that invitation is a personal choice on the part of the candidate. But the radio station needs to be able to prove that they at least sent out an invitation to all parties so that there's no potential bias by the radio station. Okay, the legal ID. The FCC requires that all broadcast radio stations present their legal ID as close to the top of the hour as possible. Now, there's lots of different things that we use to identify radio stations, right? The call letters, generally 4 letters, either beginning with W if you're east of the Mississippi or K if you're west of the Mississippi. There's a couple of 3-letter call letters that are still in existence that were grandfathered in from a long, long time ago, but and they never let their license lapse. That's why they were able to maintain those 3 letters. But any new radio stations are all going to be 4 letters long. W east of the Mississippi, K west of the Mississippi. Frequency, in our circumstance, let's say we've got 88.1. That's our frequency, right? That's how listeners can find us. The city of license is what the name of the town is that appears on the FCC license for the radio station. Oftentimes, that city is the same city that you broadcast from, but not always. So at the top of the hour, you might hear a city of license that doesn't quite match, might be a suburb of the main city or something like that, but that's because that's where the radio station is actually licensed to. Now, the slogan, something like what is shown here, nobody plays more 80s, or it might be something else, the hog, the river, right? Those types of things, the real alternative. Those slogans help identify the station. But there are very specific components of a legal ID. A legal ID must include a station's call letters followed by the city of license. That's it. No other information can come between those two things. You can include other stuff on either side, but a legal ID must include the call letters and the city of license. And the reason for that, the reason why we don't include something like frequency in there is because it's not specific to any one radio station, right? The radio station that I'm used to here has a frequency of 88.1, but there are other 88.1 radio stations in the country, right? So the city of license and the call letters are the only unique identifiers of a radio station. So those are what's included in a legal ID. Important things that you need to know that the FCC is concerned about. They care about slander. It's when a person, a DJ or somebody else on the radio station, knowingly makes a false spoken statement that damages a person's reputation. And of course, that's a private citizen, right? Public figures, you can talk all about them because it's assumed in their role as a public figure that they're going to be spoken about. But slander is, again, maliciously and knowingly making a false statement about a person. So be careful what you say about who. Payola and plugola refers to the unreported payment to a DJ or a radio personality for playing some sort of content. So the easiest and most obvious example of this is a record label pays a DJ under the table a bunch of cash to spin a particular record and talk favorably about it. So receiving cash under the table unreported to a radio station is payola. And plugola is similar but slightly different, and that's in plugola is making mentions about a particular business or something because they're going to pay you in their services, right? So I could talk about liking a particular brand of coffee. I like Starbucks brand coffee. It's the greatest. Talk about it on the air, and Starbucks gives me a free coffee every time I come in there. So that's payola and plugola. And really, the FCC is concerned with this because they're protecting the radio stations that pay for the licensing fees. They're protecting the radio stations from their own employees, right? I could be an employee at a radio station like a DJ or something like that, and I could be making statements about my favorite businesses, about music, and receiving all these benefits and financial gain or something like that. And it's really the radio station that should be benefiting from doing those things. So the FCC is helping to protect the radio stations from themselves, honestly. Okay, the radio station in regard to content is very concerned with obscenity. Obscenity is never allowed by the FCC on traditional broadcast television or radio at any time. Now, here's the definition of obscenity. It's content that appeals to an average person's prurient interest, depicts or describes sexual conduct in a patently offensive way, and lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So in order to be labeled obscene, the content has to meet all three of those things. Okay? If it doesn't, then it's labeled indecent, and it's allowed sometimes, but you got to be careful about it. But obscenity is never allowed. So across the board, indecency is okay some of the time. Obscenity is never okay. The trouble with this is whose idea of serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value are we going by, right? It's very subjective. So these are sort of antiquated rules, but they've been around and established for so long. They're still being held on to. And as time has gone on, we've stretched what these things mean, right? We've had artistic or scientific value has leaked into our content and pushed the boundaries a little bit. So obscenity now isn't what obscenity was 45 years ago or something like that, but it still exists. Safe harbor is a time period in which radio stations say, well, we can transmit material that might be indecent for children. So those hours are actually 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. I guess the FCC is assuming that that's when, if there's good parenting around, children are going to be sleeping, not listening to the radio at that time. So we can be a little bit more flexible about airing indecent content during that time. Some radio stations still decide to stay completely away from that. But safe harbor, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. All right, this brings us to a hoax broadcast. It is defined by the FCC to be illegal to broadcast something that is false if it's going to cause substantial public harm. And this came about, as the picture might suggest, because of Orson Welles and his rendition of War of the Worlds, and how people literally tuning into that radio broadcast just didn't know that it was a play. It didn't know it was a radio drama. I thought things were really happening. And what this comes around to is that, well, Orson Welles probably at the time knew that this was going to cause some issues, but he did it anyway. And he made very little mention that this was actually a drama and not reality. So the FCC had to come along and regulate and say, well, we really need to be careful about this. So hoax broadcast is an illegal thing as long as you know it's false and you know it's going to cause public harm. All right, some specifics about non-commercial or public radio. Non-commercial radio cannot air advertising. They air underwriting, which is a sponsorship in a different sort of way. It does not include a call to action, does not include qualifying statements, and it makes no mention of cost. So those are things that you are restricted on public nonprofit radio. You cannot urge people to go do something. You can't say if a local business is a sponsor for a particular program, you cannot say that that establishment offers the best product in town, because that would be a qualifying statement. You also can't mention cost, including the word free. Free is a cost. Free is $0, therefore it's a cost, therefore you can't talk about it on non-commercial radio. So you can say, for more information, you can visit this website. You can offer people the opportunity, but you can't say, go do this. So that's where the call to action comes into play. All right, the final thing that I'll say is that in regards to copyright, the FCC is concerned with whether or not you're following the legalities of copyright. Not every radio stations, just by default, aren't allowed to play whatever music they want at a music radio station, let's say. No, you actually have to pay performance rights organizations annual fees to have access to their library of content and the artists and the content that they house, right? So you can't just go on the air and start playing anything you want. You actually have to pay these annual fees, at which point you have access to the broadcast of that content, but you don't necessarily have the authority to rebroadcast that, say, on an internet stream or live stream onto a platform like YouTube or some social media platform. It'll get flagged for copyright because the radio station has the rights to that content, not the individual. So that's sort of how copyright works in regards to radio. There you go, the FCC rules and regulations, just about as quick as I can do it. Lots of important information there if you're going to be a media production person. So I encourage you to delve a little bit deeper and research some on your own. But the FCC is still an important figure and still regulates traditional broadcast radio and television, amongst other things.